How do armies change over time? It's a question at the core of fighting effectiveness. Training, combat experience, structure, commanders all have a bearing on a force's ability to vanquish a foe. But what happens when change is needed at a deeper level? What if the commanders and troops aren't the problem, but the very fabric of how the army operates is flawed? How do you rework decades of mismanagement and missed opportunities in a force that is already deployed on active operations? These are questions that have taxed military minds for millennia and will do for millennia more. But they're at the core of understanding the shifts that the British Army went through over the course of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Tonight, Kevin Linch returns for the third instalment of our deep dive series on the British Army with one thing firmly on our minds: reform. We discuss the state of soldiers' pay, changes to training, rivalries between different branches of the armed forces, and the role that all of this had on the capacity of redcoats to take the fight to Napoleon's men. This is Reforming the British Army, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your quartermaster, Liam Telfer. And as you heard in the sexy intro there, we're up to part 3 of what we've just been discussing is probably an uncountable series covering all aspects of the British Army. Everything, I would say everything redcoat, but actually that would be incorrect. We'd need to give a shout out to the blue coats and the green coats. Although, you know, that's
greencoats. Really? Do we care that much about the boys in green? Really? Like they just turn around with like their mullets and occasionally sort of make a comment at a pretty lady, single-handedly win the entire war apparently, and then ride off into the sunset. That's all that happens if you're in green, right?
I didn't want to go down that route straight away, Zach.
Derail an episode before we've even started it. What?
Yeah, we do a great job at sort of alienating our listeners early doors. So that's anyone with an affiliation to the 95th, or even you could say the KGL lights that have they've just switched off. Anyway, never mind. We as ever with this series, we have the absolutely fabulous Kevin Linch with us. Kevin's an associate professor of modern history at the University of Leeds. He specialises in the history of Britain in the 18th and early 19th centuries, focusing on the history of Britain's armed forces and their relationship to wider political, social, and cultural trends. He is the author of the recently published The British Army, 1783 to 1815, and Britain and Wellington's Army. Working with Dr. Simon Quinn, he's also recently launched an online database of British Army officers available at georgianarmyofficers.org. We'll put all of these links in the show notes as always, and I'm sure we'll be doing an episode purely around that database very soon. How are you, Kevin?
I'm good, thank you. It's lovely to be back again.
Great news.
Is it though? Is it really? Like episode 3, we're probably tackling question 3 at this point in time.
You're in one of those moods, Zach, already.
Oh, I'm always in one of those moods. You know me by now, Kevin. You've worked with me long enough.
He's definitely lively today, isn't he?
I might be in for a rough ride today. Then,
well, I'd trying to keep things on track for at least the first 10 minutes until our share Emperor Wing Commander, the Napoleonic nerd in chief, gets his hands on the mic again. I'm going to actually sort of slightly derail that sexy intro, and we will be concentrating on reform and those changes during the period. But I think what I'd like to establish to start with is something that we touched on in an earlier episode, and that's the different types, the sort of different layers within the army. We've sort of touched on them, but we haven't really gone into any detail on the regular army, the militia, the fencibles during this period. And I think to kind of try and ask this question in one go, we'll be down a rabbit hole before we know what's good for us. So I think it'd be best if we broke it down. So if you could start off by talking us through the different layers under that kind of wider army
Mm,
umbrella during the
yeah,
period.
yeah, because there is a kind of, and it does kind of link to the start, really. It's kind of, well, what are we trying to reform? Kind of what was the army in the period? Yeah, and so there is the sort of the starting point that everyone knows. So there is the regular regiments of foot, the regiments of cavalry, and the Board of Ordnance who run the Royal Regiment of Artillery and the Royal Engineers. They kind of sort of combine to be what's generally termed the regulars. Sitting kind of alongside those um, is the militia, which was a home defence force raised to, at least at the start of the wars anyway, raised just to defend England. So there was a militia in England and Wales, but not in Scotland and Ireland. As the wars progressed, a militia is introduced. And in terms of the way they look and they're drilled and organised, they are kind of identical to the regiments of the British Army. The big difference is that they're organised at a county level. Um, there's a kind of form of conscription behind it, but it's very rarely used. So that there were incidents where they were meant to be taking names out of the hat, and if your name got called up, for your parish, then you'd be sent in the militia. But there was ways of getting around that, and most soldiers did. Um, once these regiments were organised on a kind of sort of county basis, but once they were mobilised, they effectively became practically the same as a regiment of foot, but could only be used within the country that they were raised in. And some of the reforms that come along in the period allow the militia to be used a little bit more flexibly. So the English militia regiments could be sent to Scotland, and Scottish militia regiments could be sent to Ireland and England. So it becomes a bit more of a UK-based force. You mentioned the Fencibles. And then I acknowledge there's a kind of another person out there who could talk for a lot longer about Fencibles, and that's Rory Butcher. So I'm kind of paraphrasing basically his work. They in a way kind of sit in between the militia and the regular regiments of the British Army. So for home defence, again, so just for the defence of the British Isles, at least that's how they start off with. But they don't officially have this kind of sort of county organisation behind them. They're raised by by particular, certainly in Scotland, by local landowners, magnates, kind of people who wanted to raise a regiment, if you like, but not necessarily want to get involved with raising a regiment for the British Army or the regular British Army. So these become like regiments of foot again, but only used in the British Isles. But so they sort of sit in between the militia and the regular army. They only exist really through the Revolutionary Wars, through the 1790s, and then most of them are got rid of by the by 1803. They're also sometimes a bit of a stopgap for where places don't have a militia. So I mentioned a moment ago that at the start of the wars, Scotland didn't have a militia, but one of the ways they sort of found a home defence force was creating lots of fencible regiments to kind of defend Scotland instead of those. And then the militia comes along in 1797. So you've got those kind of tiers. They would all be full-time soldiers. And that's one thing that does kind of unify all of those. Once they were enlisted, they were in the army full-time. That was their kind of job. Underneath, and kind of alongside those, is another massive layer, which is all the part-time home defence forces, and they're called yeomanry, volunteers, armed associations, all sorts of kind of wonderful titles that they come up with. Kind of a bit Dad's Army, kind of weekend warriors, sometimes, so honestly, kind of actually there because they felt they wanted to do their bit, but also sometimes there because it, gave them a nice uniform. Got to parade around town in their fancy scarlet coats. But also as well, for some people, it's a bit of extra pay as well, frankly, I think, but certainly for, those that were working at the same time. That force is enormous. It's staggering the size of it by the sort of height of the invasion crisis in 1804, 1805. It's certainly knocking on the 300 to 400,000 people involved in that. And most towns would have one of these kind of volunteer corps, home defence forces. Even most parishes would probably have a few of these soldiers from them. Um, that was kind of quite new to the period, to the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, this kind of mass mobilisation of part-time soldiers. All the other things, the regulars have obviously go back to the 1660s. The militia in England had existed from the 1750s, and fencibles had started to appear about the same time as well. So, but these volunteer corps were a really sort of big change. So those are sort of layers in terms of arms, if you like, or different kind of types of soldier. But as I mentioned earlier on, the Board of Ordnance sort of sits slightly outside of that, and their troops as well, the artillerymen and the engineers, which were run a bit differently from it. And then we could add all the other sorts of, not necessarily weird and wonderful things, but sort of slightly to one side things, if you like. The medical service was a separate department. Supplying troops through the commissariat was a separate department. There was even a clerical, in the sense of clergy, department, which was separate from the regular regiments of the British Army.
With those layers, I think, in my head, I'm looking at those, and my initial reaction is the costing. That if you've got 400,000-500,000 people in local volunteer services, where does the money come from to support that, even if they are only part-time? And similarly with the sort of fencibles, if they're being raised by local landowners, local business owners, are they potentially benefiting more because, Lord so-and-so is throwing lots of money at his fencibles compared to, say, the county militia?
Yeah.
And is there any sort of rivalry that springs up, that or even a serious competition for resources?
Yeah, at a basic level, in terms of pay of soldiers and basic equipment, that was all covered for by the state. So it was being paid directly through from Parliament, or the taxes and the things we talked about in other episodes, in the kind of the way that the army operated. So that was being funded through those arrangements. But then that doesn't stop people from topping it up, at some stages. And certainly in the volunteer corps, these kind of part-time home defence forces, you can see people doing that, that they're not happy with the sort of basic level of equipment that's being offered to them, or the basic uniforms, and they want, and they're prepared to pay. And that being a sort of marker of their, both their wealth, but also their standing, if you like, in their community, that they can afford to do that. It's basically kind of showing off, but in a kind of sort of slightly charitable way, but not quite. It looks good for them. And perhaps for some of them, they were expected to do it as well. You see sort of some of often they would have subscriptions for some of these armed, particularly the home defence forces. And if you were Lord so and so, and a merchant had put down that they were going to give £50, then you might feel that you had to put down more than that person because of where you felt you were in the social hierarchy in that region. There's a lot of that going on in the part-time home defence forces. A bit of that in the militia, less so, because they're kind of full-time soldiers. And I think if there was people spending extra money on it, sometimes it would go on things like bands, the musicians in a unit, some fancy uniforms for a particular few, or sometimes paying for extra things. Medical things would be a good example, like getting their troops inoculated. You're kind of paying for actually we're prepared to get a really good doctor in and, look after them a little bit better than perhaps some others. But you wonder whether the doctors were using them for a giant medical experiment. But, it's just not unheard of in the history of the armed forces. There's little bits like that, I think. The fencibles too, probably the same in a way. They might splash out on some, slightly more interesting uniforms, shall we say, or add to the uniform fund that they get from the government. The same about bands and musicians. Also flags, actually. Roy could probably do good stories about some, fencible flags and kind of what was on those, and perhaps a bit about, how interesting they are as artifacts that people would want to invest money in. Yeah, and the kind of sort of symbolism of the regiment is kind of right. That's where we want to put some money in. Some of those things actually did happen in the regulars too, but that was probably was. Yeah, I'm pretty happy to say that was much more regulated. Yeah, more inspections of that, more closer eye on the expenditure, and whether they were meeting the king's regulations about all these sorts of things. The other area where people could put a bit of money, and this certainly happens with the fencibles, is in recruitment. Sometimes the government would limit the amount of money that was offered to new recruits. The kind of bounty, that upfront cash payment for joining that most soldiers got. But commanders could top that up if they felt, well, I really want to have this regiment, so I could put some extra money in to kind of recruit it as quickly as possible. Then they might be prepared to do that. Of course, the temptation might be then, and probably was afterwards, for some of those officers to try and recoup that money back through kind of basically corruption, but kind of manipulating the books a bit in terms of pay and equipment and funds that they did get from government. Perhaps they would see it as compensating them, but the government didn't. This was embezzlement, basically.
And we are going to get onto reform. I can promise the listeners we are going to get there. There's a couple of things that have sort of sprung to my mind from your last point there, to do with the sort of relationships between the different layers and the kind of regulations that those layers are bound to. Now, are they all bound to exactly the same? Or, for instance, are militia regiments biannually inspected and things similar to the regulars? And, does that develop, do the sort of, I don't want to necessarily say part-time forces, because I know that some of them were full-time as well. Yeah. But does that develop, in lockstep with the regular forces throughout the period?
Yeah, there is a big dividing line, I think, between the part-time home defence forces, these volunteer corps, and all the other full-time soldiers. I think it's a little bit fuzzier at the beginning of the period, but certainly by the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, the part-time soldiers have their own set of kind of how they are inspected and how they are reviewed and these sorts of things. I mean, they're all drilling in the same way, but the kind of sort of, the management of them is different. At that same time, all of the other forces, so the militia and the regular regiments of foot, regular regiments of cavalry, and all those sorts of things, are all inspected in the same way. You mentioned those biannual inspections. Well, at least they should be happening. Whether they do or not, it's a different matter. But in terms of the regulations, yes, they are treated the same. One of the kind of differences is actually the regiments of artillery. A regiment of artillery, there's only one, but had lots of battalions. The Royal Engineers are completely separate from that kind of inspection regime. Early on in the period, there was some kind of negotiation, kind of argy-bargy almost, about quite the status of, say, the fencible regiments and the militia regiments, and particularly where they stood in relation to each other. Because although they were all sort of treated the same in terms of, well, you're meant to be using roughly the same drill book, all meant to have these inspections every 2 years, twice a year, sorry, and by roughly the same set of generals as well. What the pecking order was in terms of when they were together took some sorting out. It's all to do with kind of precedence and kind of, well, if you've got two captains and one from the regulars and one from the militia, who commands who, and these sorts of things. And then by them being full-time soldiers and therefore working together, a lot of that friction starts to appear. If they're in a camp on the south coast somewhere and you've got a couple of regiments of militia and a couple of regiments of foot together at the same time, in close proximity to each other, and actually kind of getting a bit bored as well, then you start to see some of these sort of things rubbing up against each other about, yeah, okay, who goes first, and who comes second, and these sorts of things. In almost every aspect of military life, these sorts of difficulties start appearing. So there is, I suppose, there is a little bit of reform in that about actually sorting some of these things out because they haven't really been worked out before. And that is quite important, I think, for the army to work out that kind of right, what is this unit and where does it stand in relation to all the other ones.
See, at this point, I have good news, Kevin. I only have 5 additional questions or follow-up points to make.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I know. Welcome to the Rabbit Hole podcast. Liam, we need to work on that rebrand, mate. It's long overdue. Firstly, just to pick up on what you were saying about embezzlement, yeah, big problem just across the army anyway. I just had a quick check of the data from my doctorate. 6.6% of officer trials are for embezzlement, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but actually that's significant. Your biggest proportion is probably 23-ish% for any single category. So 6.6, I think it comes in at something like number 4 or number 5 in the most common charge. So that's it's an endemic problem across the army for sure. And of course, those are just the cases that make it to trial.
Exactly, they're the ones we know about.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of my follow-ups are fundamentally sort of under a banner of competition, really, in terms of having these different arms and wings and subgroups, and they're all ultimately competing for the same pools of stuff. And I know that's a highly technical term, but I mean that in multiple ways, because we're talking about competing for the manpower, we're talking about competing for material, muskets, and okay, not uniforms necessarily, because they can be sourced through other means in some cases, but equipment matters. Stores, they're a finite resource, as is money fundamentally. And so you've got all of these different natures of force all trying to get access to this same finite material. I was reading just recently about the East India Company. I know I keep making it about India people, but this is actually genuinely relevant to this conversation because
it is.
Actually in the 1790s, the East India Company is kind of going, look, we need men, European, because particularly the European regiments are trying to recruit from England. There's the big backwards and forwards between the British government and Dundas and even York, Duke of York as commander in chief. Everybody sort of going, okay, well, maybe we can supply the East India Company with 2,000 men a year. And then the East India Company kind of turns around and throws its arms up and goes, well, you sent us 200, not 2,000. You need to do something about this, please. Which gives you an indication of how much competition there is for this finite resource of manpower. So the first way to tackle that, I guess, is in terms of hierarchy, both in terms of perceived hierarchy, but also the reality. What do these respective pools of forces, to use a highly untechnical term, where do they respectively think they sit in the pecking order? But then also, what's the reality and the priority in Whitehall, in Horse Guards, where these decisions actually have to get made in terms of, well, actually, you know what, we're a bit short on muskets right now. So who's going to get this batch?
Yeah. Having a big can of worms for us there, Zach. That's what you do, isn't it?
It's what I do best on this show.
Yeah. I suppose where I can start with is actually where they would have liked the kind of hierarchy to be. And it would have been, the kind of frontline fighting troops, so the regular army, the regiments of foot, regiments of cavalry, and the Royal Artillery, Royal Engineers. That's who they would most want kind of the resources to go to. And you're right, it is a combination of kind of manpower and equipment and money, the finances, both to pay them, but also to kind of supply everything that they need. The reality is, and there's a kind of sort of bottom up view that, particularly from the manpower, that's not where actually sometimes people do want to go. And there is an attractiveness for people looking to join the armed forces about sometimes home service, or which might be the festivals or the militia, um, or actually the volunteer corps as well. Actually, kind of just having to be a soldier for kind of 20 days a year is kind of quite appealing, rather than actually signing away, basically the rest of their life, um, and being sent to potentially places like India. Um, and then the sort of strategic context comes in there. So sometimes, particularly in Whitehall, they can't afford to be choosy and give the resources to the regular army, because they really need troops to defend the UK, the British Isles. And so the money and the resources goes to, or the priority goes to the militia and to the fencibles, to raising those, because the context is, well, we need the men to defend Britain because we're under threat of invasion. Um, and often, quite frequently, to do the sort of switch happen at some stage where they then try and change the dynamic by encouraging particularly men, particularly the trained soldiers that are in the militia and the fencibles and the home defence forces a little bit as well, into the sort of front line, into the regular army. And there's a lot of seesawing about that, and different ways of doing that that they try throughout the period. So that's part of one of the stories about recruitment, which will probably be another podcast episode. Is all about recruitment, but we'll get to that. And similarly with the kind of equipment as well. Yeah, the Board of Ordnance does have this dilemma about where do we send all the muskets, and I mean they are very good at making a lot of them, but still they can't make enough for, in certainly 1804, 1805. What are they looking at? 600, 700,000 kind of soldiers. They've never had anything like that. And they've also got to supply the Navy as well. I mean, that's the other elephant in the room, or maybe it's a whale in the room, is the Navy. It's kind of like, they need the manpower as well. They need they need all the gunpowder. They need cannons. They need all of this sort of, all that other equipment that they supply. So, they're there as well. So I think there is this constant sort of shuffling around of resources, which is all sometimes a bit ad hoc, and kind of on the fly. It's kind of, well, this is the immediate priority we've got to sort out. So that's where we'll put the resources. And then trying to sort of unravel that decision, or change, or, reform or change things to make that decision kind of work for the new context that they're in. I only mentioned the East India Company as well, but it's another big more demands on the people, more demands on people, resources, uniforms. Yeah.
So let me add further complication to this in terms of the education element, because this always strikes me as the most obvious distinction perhaps between what we might call the Board of Ordnance arms, i.e. the engineers and the artillery, sort of much more technical, inverted commas, heavy emphasis on inverted commas, corps, not to disparage against infantry and cavalry, unless the infantry, of course, are green coated. So when it comes to the training, particularly of the officers, the obvious distinction, of course, is purchase. Promotion becomes about seniority for those. And I'm curious about the tension that creates between the artillery and engineers versus the infantry officers, the cavalry officers, who in some cases, if they've got the funds available to them, are jumping regiments, faster than we would jump on and off a bus today. But then also in terms of the perceived value of these individuals, if you've got somebody who has had to go through an educational process, are they perceived as being more? I mean, obviously, they're more scarce anyway. That's one of the big problems. I mean, think about Wellington at Badderhof, when Picton doesn't understand why on earth he's crying at the fact that 4,000 of his guys are dead at his feet. He starts swearing about the fact that he hasn't got enough engineers because there aren't enough of them to go around. All of this is becoming a bit of a waffle, really. Big surprise on this show. But How does that manifest itself? There you go. There's a very nice broad
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
nothingness of a question. But
Yeah,
I've
thanks for that.
yeah, I've hurled a bunch of complex problems at you. I guess what I'm really getting at again is sort of rivalries. You know,
Yeah.
is there tension between the two? How does that tension play out? But then to finally bring this interview round to reform a mere 30 minutes into it, um, we do see a very slow move towards some professional education and professional training being done for particularly staff officers,
Yeah.
right? Think about
Yeah.
High Wycombe.
Yeah.
So,
Mm,
how do those two
mm,
differences in approach to the professional work of soldiering kind of
mm.
feed into one another, bounce off of each
Yeah.
other? Again, not technical, but there are many problems for you to enlighten us about. So please have at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Um, I hmm, where do I start with this? I suppose, yeah, one place to start is probably the state of the army in the 1790s, and to think about that. Yeah, you do have this kind of very small core of officers who are artillery officers and engineers who have a lot of training versus a lot of our officers in all the other units who don't. And that kind of may have worked okay if they were progressing in the same way as you've kind of highlighted. But the fact that, some officers can purchase their way, various forms, certainly in the early 1790s with the massive expansion of the war from, ensign and lieutenant up to lieutenant colonel within kind of 18 months. Whilst for the artillery officers, they might be looking at 10, 15, 20 years to kind of make that kind of progression. That does cause some upset, I think, and some disquiet. One thing that emerges, like many things kind of in the British Army in this period, is they learn to kind of make the system work for them. So certainly by the Napoleonic Wars, artillery officers, good ones, and ones that are being identified as being useful, are getting promoted through brevet rank. So they have this kind of, right, okay, you may only be a captain in the artillery, but we will make you a lieutenant colonel in the army overall. And then using that system of this kind of dual rank system that the army had, to give them some parity with the officers in the infantry and cavalry, and let them also then, fill positions in the army of that rank that were important. So the quartermaster generals and the adjutant generals were the kind of armies, these kind of staff roles. Um, I'd love to see the figures about, actually, and this is probably something I ought to do really, about whether they were filled with more officers from the artillery and the engineers, or officers that had some kind of background, with that in the period, whether they're seen as kind of, you know, more trustworthy in those, more competent in those roles. But yeah, that's another project for another day, I think. Yeah, but then you're right, yeah, about the Royal Military College appearing, and some, you know training for officers in the infantry and cavalry appearing, and that being important, as well as kind of signalling, I think, that it was important to have an education, but also a way of identifying, particularly with the senior college, which you mentioned, kind of is where the staff officers or potential staff officers go, a way of an officer signalling that they were serious about kind of their military career, going and doing that course and then coming back from it and being then part of this pool of people who would go on to have, um, those staff roles, those command roles in the army, separate from the kind of, the regimental officers working up, whichever way, whether it's seniority or purchase, from being an ensign up to, if they were lucky, a lieutenant colonel. I think probably it's another thing that happens almost kind of accidentally, which is just through the expansion of the army. So there's massive expansion in 1793 to 95, and that just means promotion goes crazy, basically. But as the army sort of settles down, certainly in the infantry and cavalry, um, and the units get larger, which is quite an interesting kind of reform aspect. So they get bigger, so you have more junior officers to a sort of smaller pool. The ratio between the sort of higher ranking officers and the junior officers changes and that does slow up promotion for the infantry and the cavalry, and not quite as slow as it is in for artillery and the engineers, but but you definitely start to see a sort of, there's a group of people who just perhaps, if they're lucky, might make it captain. In the Napoleonic Wars because of the sort of structure that the army has, and the way it's changed in its how many men are in a company and how many companies are in a battalion stays the same actually, but how many battalions are in a regiment changes. So there might only be, one lieutenant colonel for or two lieutenant colonels for 30 or 40 captains, whilst in the 1780s it might have been about well, technically 1 to 8, but then actually the lieutenant colonel was also a captain. So actually it was more like 1 to sort of 5 or 1 to 4 in some cases.
Okay, so staying with that theme of change over time,
Mm.
we're going to get back and give the people what they want, or what certainly what Zach promised in the intro. And I think this is going to be a fairly broad question for you to sort of have at, Kevin.
Mm.
How do the army regulations develop over the period? And I think it's really important to look at what leads those changes and developments. Is it something to do with the sort of the political state at any given time? Potentially, I know we touched on previous episodes about the certain personalities that are in the seats of power. Or is it closer to the strategic situation? Or is it both? I'm sure there's probably occasions where that's relevant, and perhaps even other examples where something else entirely is responsible for the development.
Mm.
So yeah, how do those develop over the period?
Mm. I think they develop in different ways and at different paces depending on what the regulations are about. Because the sort of whole totality of army regulations stretches from how are you meant to hold a musket up to the stuff we were talking about earlier about finances and kind of how much how you should actually account for the money that you're getting from the government. So there's sort of all different sort of strands going on there from about the sort of life of a soldier, the kind of financial ones and the sort of management questions about the army, um, that aren't kind of tactical. They are kind of about sort of fighting, about just kind of running a big organization. Do feel like they're driven much more by kind of politicians and the political circumstances and a bit about personalities. Um, and some of it is just driven by financial troubles too. Kind of British state short of cash. Then one of the things they might look at is, well, how do we make sure that we're accounting for the British Army properly, and changing the way they do that. But there are a whole series of kind of military inquiries or commissions of military inquiry through Parliament in the early phases of the Napoleonic Wars, which largely came about through William Pitt, the Prime Minister, trying to avoid even bigger trouble about kind of running the management of the army and sort of kicking it off to a commission to sort of sort out. But they then offer all these reports back about finances, about the organisation of the medical services, about how the Board of Ordnance is run, about really quite niche things about the sort of management of the army. So they're quite sort of political, personality driven, and sometimes context driven. When you start getting to actually, well, how do we use this as a fighting force? I think the story is a bit different. Some of it is very much driven by personalities. It's by people who just think, I think there could be a better way of doing this, and I'm going to write a book about it, and I'm going to try it out, and I'm going to go on a campaign to kind of push my ideas across the whole of the army. And David Dundas is one of them with the drill book. We've got 3 episodes without mentioning the famous drill book, but that does not necessarily feel bottom up. But I don't think anyone at the higher horse guards in the hierarchy of the army is thinking, really we've really got to sort this out, sort of thing. Certainly, people are willing to listen to him. Once he comes with those ideas, and the march is the same with the cavalry. I think another sort of character feeling. I think the British Army could be better at doing this, and also the reformers who did light infantry too as well. Um, there are bits that do come out of particular circumstances as well, I think, that kind of make the environment more conducive for these people's ideas to be listened to. Certainly in the mid 1790s, yeah, the army has gone through quite a big shock in the campaigns that it's just fought in 93, 94, 95, and not just in Europe, but also in the Caribbean too. And I think people think, yeah, we need to get a grip of this a little bit more. We need to think more carefully about this. So if people are coming up with ideas, then they're willing to listen to them. It's not that the army didn't have successes, but I think it realised, certainly in Horse Guards and some of the secretaries of war, were realising, yeah, this is a different conflict we're in now. So we do need to think about the structure of the army, the organisation of it, how we train people, how we also then kind of inspect those troops and make sure that kind of what we have decided is going to be the way we're going to be doing things is the way that it's done. And we'll have a talk about the Duke of York in more detail another day, but him in 1795 kind of doing a tour of the UK just to go around and look at all the regiments and just kind of watch them for a bit practically was a kind of sort of important moment of, we want a little bit more consistency in the way that we do things in the army from now on, because we need to have that. We need that kind of interoperability between different units and between the different things we talked about at the start, between the militia and the fencibles and the regiments of foot, that if they're operating together as a force, we need a kind of sort of common language about that. And so something like then Dundas's drill book, maybe saying that it looks attractive isn't quite the right word, but it kind of makes sense. It's like how most of us have ended up using PCs, even though we might be more attracted to kind of using some of the kind of more more whizzy kind of technology or something. It's kind of, well, that's just what everyone else is using, so let's just kind of gravitate around that.
I do love what you're saying there about the ad hoc nature of so much of this, not least because when you look at how the British government operates, when the government is pushing through reforms, I'm sure I talked about this on the podcast before in relation to military discipline, so I won't bore people with that again, but that is very much done with the sort of, oh, well, this might be an idea. Why don't we give that a whirl and see what happens there? And equally, again, you see that with people, as you talk about in relation to Dundas, sort of going, actually, you know what? I can bring forward a book. It's almost as if rather than writing an autobiography, anybody with anything remotely kind of related to army experience kind of goes, I can make some money by writing a treatise on something army related. And the number of books that result from that is frankly eye-watching. Some of them do very well and become sort of formally adopted. And it's very interesting actually to look at the dedications that are produced in terms of sort of seeing what gets the approval of being dedicated to the king, Prince Regent, whoever it might be, and therefore gets that sort of air of acceptability of, yes, somebody up on high has sort of approved their association with this, and who doesn't. So I'm, much though I'm tempted to rabbit hole in that, I suspect we might end up doing a reform part 2, folks, but because we need to talk about York and the Marianne Clark scandal and much more besides, I think a lot of that perhaps fits much better with a part 2 on reform that we'll talk about through the lens of the Duke of York. So I'm going to unusually keep this episode and this interview on track. We're on question 3, folks. We're only like 45 minutes in. Cool. And I want to pick up on something that you were saying in relation to sort of the Dundas Manual and all the rest of it in terms of soldier training. But then I guess when we talk about soldiers, we can't just talk about their training. We also need to talk about things like pay and equipment and the state, the how well it's done, because that's a really nicely grammatically constructed sentence. Well done there, Zach. How I'm a podcaster in progress, people. Seriously. How how much of an impact do the challenges there have? Because all equipment is not equal. If you've got a musket that is 20 years old,
Yeah.
that is not the same as a brand new piece of kit. Now, I'm not saying that designs are changing constantly because there are certain patterns that get adopted, but where you get changes and improvements, even little things like being able to source good quality flints, something that
Yeah.
Liam and I have talked about at great length in relation to our recent experimentation with um, firing over a sustained period of time. You know, all of these things have bearings. So, how good is the kit? First of all, how bad is soldiers' pay? There's a leading question.
I
How
think
bad
we
is
know
soldiers'
where
pay?
we're going with
Very,
that. Yeah.
Zach. If you turn around and tell me, "Oh, soldiers' pay is fantastic," I
Yeah.
think we might have
Have that
a disagreement
conversation.
on our
Yeah.
hands. Yeah. Um, but also, what part does a realization of the state of all of that training, pay, equipment have in relation to impetus to reform this wider situation? And is there a sort of a sense that, well, if we solve this, we're golden, everything's sorted, that's it, reform's going to be done and we don't have to come back to it? Is there that sort of slightly naive hope that underpins some of
Mm,
this?
mm. I don't know about the naive hope actually, because a lot, particularly when it comes to pay and things like that, again, it feels very reactive. It's kind of, yeah, the pay and conditions are appalling, and it's only when it's kind of Joe Cousins has done some really interesting work on this, on particular regiments and particular petitions, where it's kind of like, actually, this feels like if it had gone a little bit further, this would have been a really, really big mutiny in the army. And not many people know about this, in 1792 and 93. And it was kept very quiet, and paying conditions were changed very quickly. I mean, the kind of incident is quite hazy related to, I can't remember which regiment it was, one of the dragoons or dragoon guards, kind of almost refusing to go on duty. But the way that they were doing it was that they would actually prefer to have gone and been sent overseas because they would have got better pay and conditions and equipment. And this kind of started ringing alarm bells. And obviously, you've got what happened in France, kind of, 2 or 3 years beforehand on everyone's mind. So it's kind of, well, if you lose control of the military in those circumstances, that's it. It's game over. It's complete social upheaval. So the pay and equipment, I think that's a really, kind of sort of pay and conditions, a really big shock for the Army High Command very early on, that they have to change this. I think that then puts that on the radar a bit more, that they are a bit more attentive to those, literal bread and butter issues for soldiers. That, yeah, it doesn't matter in a way about how well structured the army is or how well trained it is, if the soldiers that are, the bulk of the army, aren't happy with paying conditions, um, the other stuff isn't really too important. We're going to have bigger problems to deal with than, whether they can fight in a too deep line. It has a brigade formation of 3 or 4 thousand people. So, as I said, we're going to talk a bit more about the Duke of York later on, but there is a kind of sense there that they keep an eye on this a little bit more. Pay doesn't change so much, but they do look a bit more closely about conditions and start thinking about, yeah, okay, maybe we should give people blankets because it's cold, and greatcoats becoming a big issue as well. Yeah, it's kind of, actually, if you're out there, in the field, literally, you kind of want to be warm. So, we'll try and do some things about that. The equipment is it's kind of trickier to measure. Um, but again, kind of feels a little bit ad hoc. I mean, you see through we've mentioned these, these inspections that were meant to happen every 2 years. You pick up things through that of sometimes how poor the military equipment, if you like, the kind of the muskets, the things they actually need to fight, or the swords are. But on the other hand, you've come across regiments where it's absolutely brilliant, and it seems almost random sometimes about which units have got the best bits of kit. Um, and that's tied up, I think, in the bureaucracy of the Board of Ordnance, which still needs a lot of work on to untangle why it was like this, and how those decisions were made, if indeed they were even decisions. Was it just kind of responding constantly to requests from units? So it's some of it. Sometimes it may be that it's about who was the squeakiest wheel in the army getting, the best bit of kit. And this is probably where we can talk about the rifles for a bit, really. Them getting privileged access to rifles when certainly there were other units out there in the militia, for example, and things who wanted those. And the border wants keeping more control over those. Yeah, and yeah, how far do we want to go with swords? Another discussion about swords, and Le Marchand and kind of redesigning swords and this sort of thing. I suppose some of this was still so much kind of regimentally based that it's very varied in the army, and that's sometimes what makes it interesting. Is if you go off and have a look at this and think two units look the same, but in terms of the way they could have fought is completely different, just because of the way the army worked on a very sort of regimental basis and everything being allocated in those, in that way to them.
I think Liam wants to commission an episode just on swords. There's a glint in his eye right now.
You probably want to talk to someone else, besides me, about that.
To be fair, I mean that whole last question could probably be multiple episodes. And I've got a very selfish follow up. I'm going to wrestle it away from Zach for a second. And you mentioned things like petitions and units being almost close to mutiny. Now, with the change in regulations to things like to the introduction of things like tents and like blankets, greatcoats, things like that. Is that reform and is that change in regulation coming from a welfare perspective, or is it purely a sort of advance in time? Or is it coming from regimental officers? Is it coming from other ranks? Where is that inspiration for change for that? What's going to improve a private soldier on campaign's life, and where is that impetus to change coming from?
Yeah, I think there's probably different. Actually, where that impetus comes from changes over time. You'll be unsurprised to know. And I think in the initial phase, so 1793, 94, 95, it's almost like a public campaign to do something about the conditions of the army because of the sort of the news that's coming back, particularly from Flanders, about the state of the army is horrific. The condition that they're in, the poor uniforms, the kit falling apart, and that sort of stuff. And you see these kind of practically public subscription campaigns to, we've got to equip our soldiers with some flannel waistcoats and this sort of stuff, and let's have almost like a charity drive to get this equipment to them. We'll get together and knit some shirts and stuff, or get some money, raise, particularly in the towns that make these things, blankets and being sent over to the army. So I think for that phase, that does seem to come external to the army because of the way the army is being reported on. And there's other things going on there that, is this a way for people to feel that they're involved and doing their bit, showing their loyalty, particularly for towns, that they can look good, these sorts of things. After that, though, it's a good question about whether, what's driving this. You could say it's welfare, and it certainly looks like welfare. I wonder whether it's about manpower conservation, which is obviously a welfare issue, but they're realizing as the war goes on just how tight and kind of slim the margins are from the army being able to sustain itself. That it can keep the size that it is and possibly grow a little bit based on all the problems it has in financing the army and and finding the men for it and then getting them to where they need to be. That actually, once you've got them there, you want to keep them as fit and healthy as you possibly can. And tents and blankets and greatcoats and these sorts of things are part of that. Basically just trying to stop soldiers from getting ill. Having gone through all this effort of recruiting them, training them, giving them some time in a unit in the UK for a bit, then shipping them overseas at quite a lot of expense, then getting them to the front line for them to basically kind of get a fever and sometimes certainly be out of action for a while, possibly even then die as a result. From a financial perspective, this is an enormous waste, let alone a human perspective. So I think there's some push in there which is kind of, medical welfare, but also kind of personnel management, which is underpinned a bit by finances. And I think the army gets a little, talked in other episodes about the sort of flow of information that the army gets back. I think you can see that in there, that tied to all these numbers coming in and all these statistics is a flow the opposite way, which is what are the small things, big things in some cases, we can do to try and preserve this manpower. Because Britain doesn't have a conscription-based system. It can't go, we need 100,000 men this year for the army. Off you go, this great state machine like France does, to go and find those men. It's just a different operation. So so perhaps inadvertently it becomes sort of welfare state related army. But I think there's other things going on beyond just that they cared about the soldiers. Certainly some officers did do that, and some officers were prepared to put their own money in for the tents and blankets. But thinking about the wranglings they had about the money for some of these things sometimes makes me think that there were some calculations going on about, the cost versus the benefit of some of these things.
It's very striking as well how long it takes to trickle through. It's not an immediate thing. I'm thinking here of Peninsular War 1830, well, the winter of 1812 to 13. Wellington sat there and berated the army and said, what the hell are you doing during the retreat from Burgos? You've been living a cushy life. You haven't had any privations. You haven't had any setbacks, and yet your behavior's been appalling. And everybody's kind of turning around going, what were you smoking on the way back from Burgos? Because we had we went through hell and back again. And then there's that very famous quote that gets used quite a lot, where somebody in a letter says, everybody was really peeved with Wellington, but now we've got tents, so he's our favorite person again. So sort of Wellington gets the credit for something that I suspect is actually a much bigger, much longer standing conversation along the lines of, we don't have the money for the tents, we haven't got the materiel for the tents, we can't get the tents out to you. Actually, let's make a stock of tents in Lisbon. I can imagine that's a whole like 300 pages of Wellington's correspondence just relating to how many tents are available in a particular moment in time. And it won't be that he's the one who is responsible for all of that. I'm going to stay with Wellington actually and pick up on something you said about that moment where you have this, this could have been a large scale mutiny, which has echoes of sort of Spithead and Knorr.
Yes.
Well, it happens beforehand. So sort of feels like a precursor to Spithead and Knorr, the famous naval mutinies, where everybody sort of suddenly goes, oh, hell. We nearly had a big problem there. Because what seems to fall out of it from Wellington's perspective, as somebody who loves to gripe, is the fact that the sergeants sort of have their gap in pay eroded by this, to the point where Wellington turns around and says, well, there isn't enough of a financial incentive for the NCOs now because we've upped soldiers' pay, and I don't think in this case Wellington is sort of going, oh, it's terrible, we're paying the poor people more for what they're doing. I think he's actually kind of going, you've done soldiers' pay, but actually you need to start thinking about NCO pay if you want to, actually make those distinctions worthwhile so that people take on the responsibility. So it sort of leads me into this question about the distinction between the idea that germinates at home and then the impact in terms of trickle down on campaign, because it's great to sort of keep your soldiers happy in barracks. But then when they go out on active operations, sometimes these reforms just, they not exactly fall flat on their face, but the reality of implementation ends up being very different to the theory of implementation. So what do you kind of observe and notice in terms of those disparities? Are there any cases that very obviously come to the fore of these things just not working? But equally, are there reforms that people just sort of implement on the fly out on various theatres of operation, whether it's Egypt, whether it's the West Indies, whether it's India, whether it's wherever, Spain, Portugal, you name it, where people go, we've got to do something, so we'll try this. And then suddenly the guys back in Whitehall go, oh, that's a good, why didn't we think of that? And then suddenly that becomes a much wider policy.
Yeah. I think on the kind of sort of reforms on the fly, or kind of, if you like, experimentation in the field, or kind of adaptation in the field, then coming back. Um, there's probably a different story to be told about light infantry, I think, that relates to that and the campaigns in the Caribbean. Because there is the whole, the, the standard model, if you like, of kind of, it's John Moore and Sean Cliff and all these sorts of things, and drill books coming out, and rifles getting formed and these sorts of stuff. But bits of it are coming from that experience of kind of, well, we have got Dundas' drill book, and this is how it says we're meant to operate, these sorts of things. How we're meant to march and all the formations we're meant to do. And then they go, it's not like the British Army hadn't been fighting in the Caribbean before, but it comes up against this environment and a type of conflict as well, which is kind of this just irrelevant practically. And so you do see, more, experimentation in kind of tactical organization, kind of, sort of light infantry tactics, which I think does then come back to Europe, if you like, but it is through people as well. I was a bit dismissive of Moore earlier on. He was in the Caribbean, so he did experience this sort of stuff. Um, and the same, similarly, not quite the same, with some things about, that the British paucity of intelligence, maps and things of particular places, and then it becoming, well, actually, sometimes we need light infantry to give us that intelligence on the ground of where to go, and I think that, that was brought home particularly in Egypt, that actually these troops, these forces have a role beyond what we thought they did, because they're the ones who are going to be doing the scouting, and you couple that with good officers who know how to sketch and draw and go out and kind of get that information and come back, bring it back. None of this is in kind of in drill books or regulations or these sorts of things. It's practice, and that leads into the Peninsular War and the kind of officers who are sent off behind the lines and doing all sorts of things and gathering intelligence. That's again not in kind of drill books or regulations at all. So there's definitely kind of those things going on. Sometimes with reforms that kind of all kind of intentions, or the way that the army wanted to operate, not um, you know being challenged by the reality of actually what it's like to fight the war. The big one's got to be things about second battalions, I think, where the idea that you'd have a unit of foot would have first battalions, best, most well-trained soldiers would be sent overseas, and a second battalion would stay in the UK, the British Isles, and would kind of feed that unit with, would be the place where recruits would be trained. They'd be sent overseas. Perhaps there'd be some flow backwards of the older soldiers, the more worn out soldiers who could go back to the second battalion. And the reality was that that didn't happen that often. Units got sent where they were needed, depending on what was available at the time in the UK, and a big spat, certainly in 1812, 1813, 1814, where the Duke of York wants, and the Horse Guards wants to bring some of these second battalions back to kind of make the army organise the way they want it to, which probably from a global perspective made sense, but I'm damn sure Wellington wasn't going to give up those soldiers. Even if there was just a couple of hundred of them, because they'd been in the peninsula for kind of some of them, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It's kind of, I'm not letting go of these soldiers. I will find a way of keeping them, and just constantly deflecting kind of letters and order. Whether it quite got to official order is kind of a bit of a moot point, really, but certainly skirting very close to kind of disobeying this order. And keeping hold of these troops, because his perspective was on fighting that war in Spain and Portugal and winning that. And those 2, 3, 4, 500 soldiers were way more valuable to him than 2,000, 3,000 new recruits that may have just landed in Lisbon as well and have got marched all the way through up to the front line. They've got to get there as well. So that was kind of the big one, and I suspect there's going to be lots of little ones like that where something's sent out from the adjutant general and the horse guards, and it's noted, but it's not really kind of acted upon. Certainly, probably some things about dress. That would be the classic one, really. Once they're out on kind of campaign, some ideas about how they should be dressed, uniform, that sort of stuff is kind of well, if you're going to provide us with some new hats, we'll take them, but we'll wait, until they turn up before we do anything about that, or this new particular way that we're meant to kind of account for certain things. Yeah, okay, we'll wait until the bits of paper that mean we have to do it like that turn up before we do that. So it's definitely kind of things about, and that's just in Spain and Portugal. I mean, thinking about somewhere in Australia, something like that, they were probably just off completely doing their own thing, really.
There must be an expectation that no one sitting in horse guards is going to sign a piece of paper and it gets dispatched. There obviously has to be a huge expectation that it's going to take a vast amount of time for this reform of regulation to be implemented. I mean, you talk about the people. I think Hugh Davis talks about it in his work really well. That sort of that military web, almost an internet of correspondence that's flying around the globe. Because getting to Lisbon is one thing, but like you say, getting to Australia, getting to India, getting to the Caribbean, getting to North America, and horse guards could sort of set the standard for all of those theaters of operations. I say it in a day flippantly, but they could.
Yeah.
Now this is the regulation. And you've got officers and soldiers going one direction, the regimental system being pushed to its limit. You talk about the provisional battalions that you mentioned, sort of with Wellington grabbing troops where he can to deal with the strategic situation as he sees it. And I know we've talked before about how that has absolutely no relevance as to what's happening in India or in North America or any of these places. But what is that expectation of horse guards like? They must know, surely, that the distribution of regulations, I mean, to a divisional level will take time, let alone to battalion company level. And how does that trickle down, I guess, is another question within this question.
Yeah, I think horse guards is reasonably savvy that it is going to take a long time to do this, and perhaps if they focus their efforts through changes, it's kind of, well, we'll do this in the British Isles first, because in some sense, if we can get that right or working in the way that we would want it to, at some stage, those troops are going to leave and probably end up overseas. So we can kind of sort of, there's an expectation that you can sort of expand from that base. Yeah, and I think they probably know also as well that that commanders are going to read and see these things in slightly different ways, interpret them in their, or adapt them to the environment that they're in. And I think perhaps quite sensibly, they don't push some things too far, I think. I mean, obviously there is the kind of the big cases between Wellington and the Duke of York kind of almost falling out about things, but they don't ever get to the point where they're thinking, well, here, Wellington is becoming such a problem here in terms of refusing to do certain things or just delaying things that we should recall him and replace him with someone else. I don't think that's ever on the, ever seriously on the cards. And I think for other army commanders as well, it has to be something, theatre commanders, if not, something really, really seriously has to go wrong for them to think we're going to get rid of them. So they are having this sort of sensible, perhaps, and slightly tricky balance to recognizing that the authority of horse guards, the sort of centre of the army, is actually exercised through this group of people, which horse guards that needs to themselves kind of uphold their authority, not by saying, basically, if you disobey us, we're going to pull you out as soon as you can and we'll put someone else in, because that would just disrupt the army too massively. So I think that, they're probably quite careful about how far they push things a bit. Certainly with other kind of army officers, with the horse guards talking to the war officers a little bit different. They're quite happy to have a fight with them sometimes, I think, about regulations and who's allowed to send orders out to the army. As a sort of what the sort of tree is, and how this information was, cascaded would be the term we'd get used these days. I mean, having worked in a big institution for a long time, I kind of feel the familiarity of that. Um, some of it goes right to the almost right to the bottom very quickly. You know, the Adjutant General will come up with, here are how we're going to do this now, on particular things, particularly when it relates to sort of pay conditions or kind of, the management of the army, or disciplining the troops, for example. And that will get sent to kind of battalion commanders, and they're still working at sometimes at that kind of regimental level that, information goes straight out to all of the different regimental commanders that there are, battalion commanders, which is kind of a little bit weird in a way when they do have all these theatre commanders, and in the Peninsula they do have divisions and brigades and all these sorts of things. That a lot of this stuff is still, but the army still thought about this kind of collection of regiments, so that's where we'll send the information, and we'll copy the colonels in, rather than it has been this big tree that sort of trickles down, and that's probably why on the paperwork that the Adjutant General in particular gets back, these monthly returns, which is about the size of the unit and how many people are ill and how many people have left and joined, deserted, all those sorts of things. On the flip side of that is kind of what orders have you received? There's kind of almost a check of, have you had this bit of information that's come out from Horse Guards or from the Secretary of War, or other kind of important bodies that we talked about in other episodes, just as a sort of checklist each month to sort of see, have you had this, and that's done at that level, which is quite a lot of information to process, I think, for the army. But that's the kind of way that they thought that they chose to think about the organisation of the army, was as kind of units, I think, as regiments and as battalions.
Is that helped by a growing development in just how bureaucracy works during this period? Again, sort of thinking about governmentally, there is this big sort of explosion in the bureaucratic structure of government, which you see in the number of departments very rapidly bringing on more clerks and all the rest of it. Is that sort of a reflection of that same impetus? It's just that the nature of things is changing during this period, and so therefore people are just getting that bit better at rolling stuff out and getting the information to the people that require it.
I think it is, and seeing that basically we experience the army of this era through those people, through the people who kept all of this paperwork, either sending the letters out or then kind of noting the receipt of them or acting on them. And there is a definite upswing in the kind of volume of it, but also the way it's organised as well. I could have a whole episode about kind of the administration of the army through the kind of records that it kept, I think. And they're actually, if you go and have a look at these things in the National Archives, they are organised in a very particular way, and they get better at it, but they are organised like a library. They are bound volumes which were intended to be on a shelf that then someone could go and pull off that shelf to go and look something up, whether it be like, the latest inspection of a particular unit, or what was the last letter we had from, Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so about his unit, or has this, has the arms that we requested for this unit been actioned by the Board of Ordnance? So it's a filing system, but kind of a different one from what we would recognise, because it is more like a library, and it probably almost certainly was an actual library in the Horse Guides building in London. And the way they're bound is kind of sort of evidence of that, because they have kind of what's on the side of these volumes, what they are, and they have an index at the back like a book. So once you kind of get your head around that, that's how the way it was organised and that's how it would be used, you can start to understand, where to look for things. And that emerges in very much in this period. I think the sort of that way of doing things, and the people doing it, the clerks, the senior clerks, and these sorts of people, they were the record keepers. They had the keys to all this information, and and that does relate to, as you said, I think, bigger trends in Britain at the time of governments getting more efficient at doing these things, having better ideas about how to do it, and also the kind of equipment to do it. That there were people who could provide all the volumes that they needed with indexes pre-printed in the back that you then filled in. There's a kind of market for that, I think, that emerges of this material, which relates to just the government getting bigger.
Must admit, there is a small part of me, much though I love everything that archives enable us to do. And don't get me wrong, the National Archives does a phenomenal job in preserving material that is in some cases in very poor health. There is a small part of me that just wishes you could sometimes use this material in exactly that way, where you could just walk into a room and go, right,
reconstruct that room.
Yeah, exactly. And just pull off the shelf, your various volumes that are going to assist you with the 57th Regiment and have them all open on a table in front of you and just flick through them. It would be a phenomenal thing, but sadly, we need to work within the realities of them. Exactly. And you talk about, an episode on the administration of the army. I'm not quite sure why you're threatening us with a good time like that.
Well, it wouldn't even be that. It would be kind of about record keeping in the army. It would be even better.
Indeed. Catnip for the Napoleonic nerdery community, I think, right there. With an eye on the time, I do just want to bring this full circle. We will, of course, folks, be coming back to questions of reform, not least, as we've alluded to, looking at York, but also other significant figures. I think we will talk perhaps more about Moore and Le Marchant and their respective reforms and the scale of impacts that they have. But I do just want to reflect at the end of this session on impact. And we've talked about varying things. We've talked about Dundas and drill manuals. We've talked about individuals bringing out treatises on various things. We've talked about the need to bolster education, address, promotion systems, the simple dissemination of equipment and the care of soldiers, and much more besides. But relatively speaking, where do these different, individual efforts rank in relation to one another? If we were to sort of think about the two or three changes that happen over this period that have the greatest impact in terms of enabling the British Army to do what it does, but much better, what would you, single out in that regard as, if it wasn't for the tents, or if it wasn't for the push on education, we would be looking at a very different British Army and a combat record that is far less sort of exalted than it is today.
Yeah. It's kind of it's the obvious answer, and it's kind of perhaps a little bit too straightforward. But I think one of them does have to be the kind of standardization of drill and tactics. I think not that there weren't adaptations and variations beyond that, but as I kind of said earlier on, I think it kind of provides a sort of baseline and a common language to which everyone can work with and then perhaps tweak and adapt. But it basically meant that if you had a soldier, an officer, a junior officer commanding a group of soldiers from the militia, they could be transported very quickly into the regiments of foot. And it's exactly the same kind of tactics operations drill that they would fit into that world quite quickly. Obviously, there's going to be lots of adjustments about kind of personnel and kind of getting to know each other, that sort of stuff. But the basic kind of a British soldier, kind of this is how they sort of operate, how they stand, how they relate to each other, how do they stand to the next how they relate to the person next to them in the line. If that wasn't there, then I think the army would be very different in terms of its kind of performance. And that's not unique to the British Army. I think obviously all armies have been through that, but I think that the story of the British Army has a slightly different timeline for that compared to others. So I think that's definitely a big one. And there is kind of more focus on that on the infantry too as well than probably the other arms, and that does make a big difference to it. Probably in terms of effectiveness is a big phrase to use in this, or a big word to kind of pull up, but in terms of sort of the army getting better at things, if I can bundle a few together, it is about kind of welfare, I think, and that is kind of both medical kind of provision which I haven't talked about too much. But then also things like tents and blankets and kind of and pay and food. And obviously they failed. Sometimes they failed really, really badly. But the the failures weren't as consequential, I suppose, or were better managed, I think, by the 1800s than they were in the 1790s. So in the 1790s, basically, the army could get crippled by kind of a few big incidents in terms of failure of, pay or food or conditions, or in the healthcare. So 1795, 1796, an enormous proportion of the British Army is just ill uh, because of where it's been fighting, but also, all these problems that it has. And that's not to say illness doesn't go away, but I think they get better at managing it. Talk about how good the care was, but it was definitely got improved, I think. And that was a bit about pay and conditions, recognizing that these were serious issues. And part of the way of dealing with some of the healthcare issues was sometimes preventative. It was about making sure that soldiers don't get too cold, or in some cases too hot as well. It's the other side of the coin, talking about South Asia and the Caribbean. And that sort of recognition of that, I think, and doing things about it and putting some resources into sorting that out, and the changes to the Army Medical Board and things, I think was that underpins a lot of the effectiveness of the army. Because I think, again, without that, the story probably would have been more like a repetition of the early 1790s, where the army could have performed very well for a short space of time, but then it breaks. And so you would have been how to have that kind of story of the Peninsular War, where the British Army can fight a campaign, with various ebbs and flows, and ups and downs, and victories and kind of near misses and all these sorts of things, but can sustain a campaign for 5-6 years. That was almost unthinkable, I think, in the 1790s that the British Army could do that. And I think part of that is the sort of healthcare and provisions and, managing the personnel, the army better.
Kevin, it's been an absolute joy. I'm not sure if Liam's got follow-ups, but at this point, we are going to let you get back to your life. Wow, 80 minutes
Was it? All right, crikey.
of foot to the floor discussion of pretty complex topics, not aided, of course, by very waffly questions on my part. Folks, go and have a look at Kevin's work, seriously. It's the least you can do to thank him for the literal hours of material that you've already got on this show. The British Army, 1783 to 1815. Britain's soldiers rethinking war and society, 1715 to 1815. And if you are a researcher in this period, or if you want to look up family names related to this conflict, then go to GeorgianArmyOfficers.org. It is a mind-blowing resource. Even in that sort of really simple sense of, oh, there's a name. I wonder where this guy goes and what he does and which units he's in. Literally within seconds, you can get this guy's entire service history. It's an insane resource. GeorgianArmyOfficers.org. Go and make use of it. Kevin, wow. Thank you so much for your time. This was installment number 3 of about 10,000. We look forward to the hours of more material to come in due course. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car, and then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds, and if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top-rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? we have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.